Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, The Basics of Ink Color Management. Presenting today is Mike Gardner, a Senior Applications Engineer and Technical Support Specialist at X-Rite. I'm Robert Grotans, the Global Digital Learning Manager, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. A couple of things to go over before we get started. Due to the number of people that are attending today's webinar, we will keep everyone muted. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the questions function on the GoToWebinar panel, and we will have some time at the very end of this webinar to answer a few of those questions. Finally, this webinar will be recorded and we'll follow up with an email after this webinar with a link so that you can view this webinar again. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike to get things started.
Thanks, Robert. Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Gardner. So today we are going to look at basics of color management, and we're going to talk about QC functionality. We're going to talk about color matching, formulation, and correction in the ink room. And we'll have a look also at data management. So we will have a look-see here at a typical color management tool. And we mentioned three functionalities that the color management tool typically helps us address, and that is QC, formulation, and correction. So let us start with QC. What does QC do for us? There is a basic question that QC in color management helps us understand. And the question is this: is the drawdown that I just made the same color as a target? And we can see here in the QC mode of this tool that we do in fact have a target. We have measured a sample, and we see on-screen color here. And then we're interested in what the answer to that question is. It the same as? And we can see that here in this color plot display, where we have a target, and then we've measured the sample, and there are numbers for LAB and delta LAB that help us understand whether this is close enough to consider a pass. And in this case, there are indicators. Here we have an indicator that this sample does pass some specification. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. There is a visual assessment here, pass in green. We also see up under the color data that there is a little green dot that says pass. It would be red if it didn't meet our specifications. And then there's a quantifier of 0.65. Again, in this instance, we have measured a drawdown, and it has captured the LAB data and shows us that indeed, to a 2.0 pass-fail tolerance, this sample passes. And as we continue to collect measurement data, you can see the other answers for different measurements. In this case, we failed, and outside of our limit at 5 units, we can zoom out and see, well, in this case, no, this sample is not the same as, and then of course, we would need to be able to describe what's wrong with it. In this case, it's not the same as the standard. It is delta E of 5 units, and it is 2 blue and 2 green. So again, quality control helps us understand a sample that we have just drawn down and how it compares to a standard. We like to keep our display views fairly clean so that it helps us understand the current sample. And this color plot basically gives us all of the information we need, but that's not the only information that we have visibility to. We can look at spectrographs. We can look at more comprehensive color data. In this instance here, we're seeing the absolute LAB data, the deltas, and all sorts of other information. And there are things like color strength, opacity, and those sorts of things that help us understand the nature of the relationship of this particular sample to the target. There are also abilities within color management tools to look at scatter plots. So for the course of a run, perhaps, you can see where the bulk of your data lies in terms of the standard. Now, color management tools also give us the facility, of course, to create new standards. We can measure them, we can import them via files, we can manually input them, and so forth. In this instance, I'm going to go ahead and measure a sample with the device. So we have just taken a measurement of a device. There's an indication of what kind of color it is. We could look at the spectral curves, and then we'll name it blue-green standard, and we could assign a tolerance to it. In this instance, we'll make it 1 unit. And now then this new target is available for us to compare samples. And to do that, we simply take care of our drawdowns. We'll measure and here we have the answer to this particular measurement. It's not quite meeting the threshold of 1.0. Take another measurement. And then this second sample does pass our specification. So again, quality control aspect of color management helps us understand particular sample or set of samples, groups of samples, and how they relate to a target that we have either created or somebody has provided to us. We also have the facility within color management tools by which we can say, hey, you know what, we have a target color and we need to match it with a set of inks that we have in the ink room. So in this instance, we start talking about formulation. And here we see the same target that we looked at just a few moments ago. And we want to know what is it that we need to mix together, weigh up, and draw down in an effort to match this color. So we have a series of inks. This is a offset ink system, a choice of the inks, and we can simply press formulate. And the software says, you know what? We believe that if you weigh up these inks in these amounts, you should get a delta E that will pass and be a match to the target color. Again, similar types of displays in terms of this recipe here is predicted to generate a match, but it's not necessarily the only recipe that's available to us. Many formulation systems will give us different candidates for color matching. And as you go through the list of these candidates, you can see that the recipes change variously. Now, a lot of people say, well, I want to match this color and there should only be one way to match it. And, you know, if you think about traveling, when you book an airline ticket from Charlotte to Dallas, there are many options to get you there. And in a similar fashion with formulation, because of our choice of inks, there may be different candidates, and you may not want to use warm red with rubine red. And so you could look at a different candidate. So that's formulation. Again, we're trying to match a color as quickly and efficiently as we can, and the formulation part of the color management tools helps us get there. Now, the nature of the process is such that if we like this recipe, we'll go weigh it up and do a drawdown, and we'll come back with this drawdown and measure it in and have a look-see at the delta E. And we'll do a visual test as well, just to back up the numbers that we see. And if we agree that we need to correct it, then we'll come into this third aspect of the color management tool, which is correction. And this gives us an opportunity to take a sample that's not quite where we want it and say, okay, can I make it better? And in this instance, we did a correction, and it says that if we add these amounts of these different components, we should take what was not a bad match, just not quite there, and make it better. And so then, of course, we would go and weigh up this add, do a second drawdown, and measure it, and hopefully we have our color match where we like it. So again, when we talk about color management tools, generally there are three aspects of it. There's the quality part. Is the sample the same as, or does it meet our specifications? Can I match this color via formulation? And then what about doing a correction as well? There are a few other options that are available in color management tools. One of them that is quite clever is a correction function, whereby if we simply have a sample, it's not quite where we want it, nor do we know what's in it, we can do a quick correct. And the quick correct allows us to generate a match based on an unknown recipe. Quick correct. Finally, let's talk about data management. What happens to all of this data that we're measuring into the system, and can we manage it? Can we access it? And those sorts of things. So most tools have the ability to archive digitally your target information. And in this instance, we've got something on the order of 4,700 standards. How do I find something quickly? Well, there are several ways. You can find anything based on username, date and time. You can even measure and look for anything that's within 2 units from what you just measured. So in this case, I measured a greenish color and found in the database that there are 4 others that are similar to it. Data management allows you also to have a look-see at recipes that you have matched previously. And you can also share some of this information via exporting. So hopefully this quick review of basics of color management helped generate some thoughts and questions. And I believe with that, we will go ahead and take time to answer a few questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. If you have any questions that you haven't submitted yet, please feel free to do so. I see a few already. Let's see here. How do I set tolerances and what should they be?
Great question. So first off, remember a tolerance is that acceptability limit. Typically, we're talking about a delta E, maybe delta E 2000. And in color management software, there is always a facility to create a default pass-fail level. Also, at the time of measurement, you can assign a tolerance. If it's a specific or a special color, you can choose a tolerance that is different than your 2.0, maybe smaller or bigger. The second part of the question is, what should my tolerance be? And that's always an interesting question, because there's not a real rule of thumb for all colors. There are industry targets. For example, in printing, it may be 2 units delta E 2000. In the ink room, it may be 1 unit delta E 2000. So it depends on your customer base and your audience. But it's a great question. Thank you.
If my delta E says it passes, should I still visually assess my sample?
Also an excellent question. So a lot of times today we hear that, you know, we want to QC or we want to formulate based on numbers. My answer is always yes. In addition to the numbers, we should do a visual assessment, because somebody at the end of the road is going to look at this, whether it's a customer or a consumer buying cereal boxes off of a shelf. So yes, we should always do a visual assessment.
How often should a device be calibrated?
Well, so your devices do need to be calibrated, and the answer is really dependent on the device that you have. So some devices require sort of a manual calibration process where you do a white tile and maybe a black trap. Some devices will calibrate themselves. So it's a good question. The answer would be dependent on the type of device. So for example, the X-Rite Exact calibrates itself, so we don't have to really worry about it. But if you have a benchtop or something like that, our recommendation is it generally once per 8 hours or once per shift. Good question.
And how many measurements should I average?
Good. So my answer would be it depends on what your process is and whether you're creating a standard versus measuring a sample. So a good rule of thumb is when you're creating or measuring a new standard, maybe average it 3 different times, moving your device as you take each of those measurements. When you're measuring samples, you may be able to get away with just measuring 1 measurement and not having to average. It's a good question. I'll also add, if you have the ability with the benchtop, for example, you might want to use a larger aperture when you're averaging these things. Thanks for the question.
Let's see, we have time for a couple more questions. Is it possible to edit recipes?
Generally, the answer is yes. Most of these formulation and correction management tools, when it gives you a recipe for you to go way up, we may overshoot or undershoot any of the ingredients. So it also, those programs give us the ability to edit the recipes for the sake of at least saying, you know what, instead of 2.46 grams, I actually put 2.53. So yes, we generally can edit formulation recipes and correction recipes.
And how many colors should I use in a recipe to color match?
It's a good question. Most of the time in ink recipes, we will use 3 different colorants, sometimes maybe 4. The challenge with using more than 3 or 4 colorants in a recipe is that we run the risk of this notion of metamerism, where we've got too many pigments in the formula that reproducing that formula time and time again becomes challenging. So in short, the rule of thumb is the fewer the better. 3 or 4 is common.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Let's see. Do I really need to look at spectral curves?
Great question. Well, what is a spectral curve? The spectral curve is, I call it the digital DNA of the measurement that you just took. And that's where all of your LABs and your delta E's originate, is from that spectral curve. My answer is typically when you're doing QC work, maybe you don't need to look at spectral curves, but when you're doing formulation, I do advise to consider looking at spectral curves, because in color matching, you're essentially trying to match the digital DNA of the target with the digital DNA of the inks that you're putting together. And having a look at those spectral curves in formulation helps you understand how close these curves are as an indication of your color match.
Awesome.
Any other questions?
There's a few more that we don't quite have time to get to. We'll do our best to follow up with you if we didn't get to our question, but that is all the time we have for today. So that will mark the end of our webinar. Again, you will receive an email with a link to this recording so that you can watch it again. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.